The United States of America was born from a profound yearning for freedom, a dramatic rebellion against the imperial powers of Europe, designed to establish a nation rooted in democracy, liberty, and justice for all. But, at the very heart of this new republic, a dark, fatal contradiction was ticking like a time bomb. For decades, a nation built on the absolute ideal of freedom found itself hopelessly entangled in the brutal institution of slavery. It's a paradox that would relentlessly tear at the fabric of the country, inevitably dragging it toward its darkest, most blood-soaked chapter. Welcome to This Explainer. Tonight, we uncover the deep-rooted causes, the devastating realities, and the lingering shadowy legacy of the American Civil War.
We're going to break down this massive historical fracture into 6 crucial chapters: a nation divided, the spark of secession, the reality of war, the turning tides, the final campaigns, and an uneasy peace.
Chapter 1: A Nation Divided.
To truly understand how America went to war with itself, you have to look at 2 completely different worlds existing within the same borders. For nearly a century, the country simply wasn't growing as a unified culture. Up in the north, you had the hum of an industrial economy, fueled by manufacturing and propelled by a massive influx of immigrant laborers looking for a new life. But down in the south, the economy was strictly, intensely agricultural. And the real turning point? It hit in 1793 with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. This one machine made separating cotton fibers incredibly efficient, sparking an absolute explosion in the profitability of the Southern cotton trade. To maximize those massive profits, Southern landowners exponentially grew their reliance on the labor of enslaved people from Africa. The 2 halves of the country were essentially living in different centuries.
You can see the tension building year by year as America expanded westward. Every time the nation acquired new land, the same burning question arose: would these new states allow slavery, or would they be free? The government tried desperately to maintain a delicate balance with the 1820 Missouri Compromise, but compromises eventually fail. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act literally forced Northerners to actively participate in capturing escaped slaves, completely inflaming the abolitionist movement. By 1854, the decision to let new territories decide their own slave status led to outright guerrilla warfare. Radical factions flooded into Kansas, turning political debate into armed, bloody slaughter. A grim period history remembers as Bleeding Kansas. The time for political solutions had simply run out.
Chapter 2: The Spark of Secession.
The violence in Kansas proved the nation was a powder keg, and the spark that finally ignited it came directly from a ballot box. The election of November 1860 changed absolutely everything. Abraham Lincoln, representing the brash New Republican Party, known for its anti-slavery stance, won the presidency. The incredible thing? He didn't win a single electoral vote in the South. This triggered a terrifyingly rapid domino effect. By December, South Carolina seceded from the Union, convinced their entire economy and way of life were under direct threat. Several other states quickly followed suit, and by February 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America. Just weeks into Lincoln's presidency, Confederate forces bombarded the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina's harbor. The standoff was over. The Civil War had officially begun.
Consider the staggering logistical and numerical mismatch the South faced heading into what would become a prolonged war. The Union had a population of 18.5 million, compared to the Confederacy's 9.5 million. And remember, 3.5 million of that Southern population were enslaved people. The Union could field an army over twice the size of the South's. Plus, they possessed thousands of miles more railroad track, meaning they could easily resupply and redeploy troops at a moment's notice. On paper, many Northerners fully believed this would be a very, very short war.
Chapter 3: The Reality of War.
Those expectations of a swift, glorious victory, they were violently shattered. At the first Battle of Bull Run, a completely disorganized Union army was sent scrambling back to Washington by determined Confederate defenders, immediately crushing Northern confidence. Then came battles like Shiloh, bringing a horrifying scale of casualties that left the entire nation reeling. And then Antietam. In just 8 hours of ferocious, relentless combat, 23,000 men were killed or wounded. To this day, it remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. Both sides quickly woke up to a dark reality. They were locked into a terrifyingly drawn-out meat grinder.
But alongside the bloodshed, a radical technological revolution was happening. The war wasn't just being fought with muskets on open fields, it was forcing rapid industrial innovation. Enter the ironclad. In a historic naval clash in 1862, the Union's USS Monitor met the Confederacy's CSS Virginia. For hours, these two iron-plated, steam-powered monsters fired explosive shells at one another, shells that simply bounced off their thick armor. In one single afternoon, every traditional wooden navy in the world was rendered completely obsolete.
Chapter 4. The Turning Tides. As the war ground its way into 1862 and 1863, the momentum finally began to shift, and the fundamental moral purpose of the conflict was utterly transformed. Despite the horrific loss of life at the Battle of Antietam, Union forces essentially pushed the Confederate Army back, handing President Lincoln a desperately needed strategic victory. And he used that exact political capital to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. By declaring that all enslaved people in the rebellious states were forever free, Lincoln elevated the war. It was no longer a mere political dispute over restoring a fractured Union. It was now a profound moral crusade to abolish slavery completely.
This shift in purpose was followed by the pivotal, blood-soaked summer of 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched an audacious invasion deep into the North, culminating in the monumental Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Over 3 agonizing days, the Union successfully repelled Lee's army. Almost simultaneously, at West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant secured the surrender of Vicksburg, granting the North full, unquestioned control of the Mississippi River. These twin victories were an unrecoverable blow. They split the Confederacy entirely in half and effectively destroyed any Southern hopes of receiving military aid or recognition from foreign powers like Britain or France. I want you to let this single number sink in: 51,000. That represents the horrifying combined casualties over just those 3 days at Gettysburg. 23,000 Union troops and 28,000 Confederates, killed, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest single engagement of the entire war, heavily crippling the Confederate fighting force for good.
Chapter 5. The Final Campaigns.
With the Confederacy severely weakened, Union leadership took the gloves completely off. General Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to command all Union armies, and he implemented a relentless two-pronged strategy of total war. First, he personally led a grinding, bloody war of attrition against General Lee in Virginia, repeatedly forcing the Confederates into battle just to whittle down their irreplicable numbers. Second, he unleashed General William T. Sherman on the Deep South. Sherman captured the vital hub of Atlanta and then marched to the sea, leaving a trail of ashes, destroying rail lines, infrastructure, and the very Southern will to fight. Ultimately, Grant's forces trapped Lee's remaining men in a brutal, modern trench warfare siege at Petersburg. The noose was tightening.
Yet, even in their desperate final days, the Confederacy was still unleashing revolutionary and deadly new technology. In early 1864, the H.L. Hunley, a fully submerged vessel, successfully approached and detonated an explosive charge against the USS Housatonic. Though the submarine and its own crew were lost in the terrifying aftermath, it became the first combat submarine in history to sink an enemy warship. The rules of naval warfare were rewritten in an instant.
But technological marvels couldn't save the crumbling Confederate logistics. Look at the sheer overwhelming speed of this timeline in April 1865. On April 2nd, the defensive lines finally broke, and Lee was forced to abandon both Petersburg and the Confederate capital of Richmond. Cut off, starving, and entirely out of options, Lee formally surrendered his army to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, effectively ending the war. But the celebration, it was violently cut short. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, President Lincoln was assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer at Ford's Theater.
Chapter 6. An Uneasy Peace.
The gunfire had finally stopped, but the monumental task of rebuilding a thoroughly fractured nation had only just begun. We have to pause and reflect on this truly horrifying figure: 1,030,000. That is the estimated total number of American casualties from this conflict, the dead and the wounded. To put that into perspective for you, it represented a massive 3% of the entire United States population at the time. More Americans died in this conflict than in all other U.S. wars combined. The trauma touched absolutely every community, North and South.
Navigating the aftermath of a civil war is an incredibly delicate, dangerous thing. The former enemies now have to somehow, some way, share a country again. Lincoln foresaw this exact difficulty. In his second inaugural address, just before the war ended and his own life was taken, he laid out a profound vision of reconciliation. With malice towards none, with charity for all, it was a desperate plea to bind up the nation's immense wounds and secure a lasting peace, rather than seeking vengeful retribution.
However, While the Union was preserved and the institution of slavery was finally permanently abolished by constitutional amendment, the reality on the ground was far, far from Lincoln's charitable vision. True integration and equality for the newly freed African American population were largely abandoned. This massive failure led directly to a deeply segregated society, severe economic disenfranchisement, and deep, lingering racial divides. The African American community would be forced into a grueling, century-long struggle just to secure the basic civil rights that the war had supposedly won for them. The scars of the American Civil War are not confined to the past. They are woven directly into the very fabric of the modern United States. It forces us to ask a haunting question. What remains of a nation's identity when its darkest chapter is fought against itself? It's a question of historical memory, heritage, and deep consequence that continues to shape our world today. Thank you for exploring this defining era of history with me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.